Hannah Moore was the kind of neighbor no one really noticed, quiet, polite, and almost invisible. But behind the pale blue walls of her Willow Lane home, she was nurturing a secret so dark it would shatter Maplewood forever. Maplewood was the kind of place people described as safe without even thinking about it. It was a small, tree-lined town where the most exciting thing to happen in a month might be a bake sale running out of pies too early. Rows of houses sat neatly behind trimmed hedges, and the streets were clean enough that a dropped coin might glint in the sunlight for days before someone picked it up. People here knew each other by name, or at least by face, and there was an unspoken belief that nothing truly bad could happen within its quiet borders. On Willow Lane, tucked away near the very edge of town, sat a pale blue house that blended so perfectly into its surroundings it almost disappeared. The lawn was tidy, the flower beds were always weed-free, and the blinds stayed pulled down no matter the weather. The house belonged to Hannah Moore, a young mother most of the town barely knew. She was rarely seen outside except for quick trips to the grocery store or the occasional walk to the mailbox. When she did appear, her steps were brisk, and she kept her eyes fixed ahead, as if afraid of being drawn into conversation. People assumed she was shy or simply valued her privacy. Some thought she might be new to the area and still adjusting, though she had been living in that same blue house for nearly 2 years. In a place like Maplewood, where neighbors noticed every unfamiliar car and every lawn that went uncut, Hannah's quiet existence was unusual, but not enough to stir real suspicion. It wasn't until whispers began that people started to admit they had noticed more. A few neighbors mentioned seeing her with a noticeably rounded stomach months earlier, then later without it, though no one recalled ever seeing her with a baby stroller or hearing the faint, restless cries that drift so easily through quiet streets at night. No toys littered her porch. No baby clothes ever hung out to dry. Life seemed to continue in her home exactly as it had before. Still, most residents of Maplewood were too polite, or perhaps too unwilling, to pry into the private matters of others. The blue house held its secrets well. From the outside, it was ordinary. Inside, Hannah lived in a world of her own making, where the blinds stayed closed during the day and the rooms were lit by dim bulbs even in the brightest hours of the afternoon. Neighbors who passed by might occasionally see her moving behind the curtains, her shadow slow and deliberate, but these fleeting glimpses only deepened the air of mystery around her. The truth was, few people could say they had ever truly spoken to her. Even the cashier at the small grocery store remembered her only as the woman who always brought exact change and never looked up when she placed her items on the counter. No friends came to visit, and no family members were ever seen pulling into her driveway. The silence around her life was almost too perfect, like the pause before a storm no one realizes is coming. Night, the pale blue house seemed to fade into darkness earlier than the others. Porch lights on Willow Lane often stayed on until midnight, but Hannah's would be switched off long before. More than once, someone walking their dog had noticed a faint flicker of light from the back of the house, as though a candle or small lamp was burning somewhere deep inside. It was the kind of thing you noticed once, dismissed, and then remembered again much later when everything had already gone wrong. In those days before the fire, there was nothing to prepare Maplewood for the truth. No loud arguments. No visible signs of trouble. Just a woman in a quiet house, surrounded by secrets no one dared to imagine. The danger was hidden in plain sight, and the town went on believing in its own safety, unaware that one of its most shocking tragedies was already unfolding behind those closed blinds. And when the first thin ribbon of smoke finally rose above Willow Lane, the peace Maplewood clung to would be gone forever. Began as something so small, it could have been ignored. A faint orange glow flickered faintly in the foggy night air, visible only if you happened to glance in the right direction at the right moment. Most of Maplewood was asleep by then. Streetlights cast pale circles onto the empty sidewalks, and the silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the summer breeze. On Willow Lane, a neighbor walking her dog stopped when she caught a strange scent. It was sharp and bitter, nothing like the comforting smell of wood burning in a fireplace. The air carried with it something heavier, more chemical. She frowned, looked toward the end of the street, and saw the light again, this time stronger. Within minutes, the glow turned to smoke, curling upward from behind the pale blue house. At first, it was thin and hesitant, but it thickened quickly. Dark plumes spilling into the night sky. The dog barked, sensing something was wrong, and its owner pulled out her phone with trembling hands. She hesitated for a moment, hoping maybe she was mistaken, but the smell was growing worse by the second. When she called emergency services, her voice shook as she gave the address. By the time the fire truck roared down Willow Lane, the glow had turned into a furious orange pulse behind the house. Firefighters leapt from the vehicle, moving quickly but with the grim precision of people who knew they were already behind. The flames had consumed the small wooden shed in Hannah Moore's backyard. Sparks spat into the air as they sprayed the structure with water, the hiss of steam filling the night. The crowd of neighbors gathered at a distance, drawn by the flashing red lights, whispering to each other in short, confused bursts. No one knew exactly what was burning or why, but every eye kept drifting toward the pale blue house, its dark windows unblinking. When the fire was finally beaten back into blackened ruin, one firefighter stepped away from the wreckage with a look that froze everyone in place. He called for the police. The crowd fell silent. There was something inside the remains of the shed, something small, something that did not belong. Word spread quickly, moving through the street like another kind of fire. Someone whispered the word baby, and it clung to the air like smoke. Investigators arrived soon after, setting up bright portable lights that cut through the shadows. They moved slowly, carefully picking through the ashes. Their gloved hands revealed the outline of tiny remains, fragile and unmistakable. There was no mistaking what they had found. The confirmation came quietly, but it struck like a blow. An infant had died in that fire. The shock rippled through the onlookers. Some turned away, unable to face it. Others stood frozen, trying to make sense of the impossible. This was Maplewood. Things like this didn't happen here. And yet, here it was, undeniable and real. People glanced toward the house again, wondering if Hannah was inside, if she even knew what had happened. But there was no sign of movement behind those darkened windows. The police went to the front door. When they knocked, the sound echoed too loudly in the quiet street. What happened next was quick and quiet, and only those close enough could see officers leading Hannah outside. She was calm, almost too calm, her face pale in the harsh light. She didn't fight, didn't shout, didn't explain. She simply allowed herself to be guided away, as though the night's events were just another errand she had to attend to. For the rest of the town, however, the night was far from ordinary. The sight of smoke curling into the sky above Willow Lane would be seared into their memories forever. They would remember the smell, the silence, the moment the whispers began. And though no one yet knew the full story, an unshakable truth had settled over them. Something terrible had happened in Maplewood, and the answers, when they came, would only make it worse. In the days after the fire, investigators began the slow work of pulling apart Hannah Moore's life piece by piece. They started with the obvious facts. Public records showed she had given birth only 3 months earlier, but there was no trace of a child anywhere in recent weeks. No one had seen her with a stroller. No one had heard a baby crying from inside the pale blue house, and no medical visits had been recorded after the birth. It was as if the child had vanished from the moment it came into the world. Neighbors' recollections painted an unsettling picture. Several remembered Hannah in the late stages of pregnancy, walking quickly to her mailbox with her head down, never stopping to chat. Others recalled seeing her one afternoon, much slimmer than before, but carrying nothing in her arms. There had been no baby shower, no relatives arriving to help, no cheerful introductions to the neighborhood as new parents often made. Most people had assumed she was simply a very private mother. That assumption now felt painfully naive. The inside of her home, once police gained access, was strangely bare of anything that would suggest a baby had ever lived there. No crib, no high chair, no bottles. The only trace they found was a single baby blanket tucked in the back of a closet, folded neatly and untouched. It looked out of place, its soft fabric and pastel colors in sharp contrast to the cold emptiness of the rest of the house. Her personal history offered few clues. Hannah had grown up in another town hours away, but her connections there seemed thin and strained. She had moved to Maplewood almost 2 years earlier, renting the pale blue house alone. She worked for a short time at a local diner before quitting without explanation. Bank statements revealed a slow depletion of her savings over the past year, along with several small cash withdrawals that investigators couldn't trace. She had sold jewelry, furniture, and even her car, leaving her reliant on short walks. To the store, when they searched for the father of the child, they hit a wall. Hannah had not listed anyone's name on the birth certificate, and those who knew her claimed she had never mentioned a partner. Without his identity, police couldn't determine if he had ever been involved, or if he even knew about the baby at all. The most troubling detail came from a series of unanswered letters found in a desk drawer. They were from a community outreach program offering support for new mothers, encouraging Hannah to join a group, attend health checkups, and seek help if she was struggling. None of the letters had been opened. Investigators began to see the outlines of something far darker than neglect. They consulted mental health records and discovered Hannah had been treated sporadically in the past for severe depression and anxiety, but she had stopped attending appointments before her pregnancy. Friends from years ago describe her as withdrawn, sometimes paranoid, convinced that people were watching her or that something bad was going to happen. By the end of that first week, the suspicion that the fire had been an accident was fading quickly. The small wooden shed had been the only part of the property damaged, and the rest of the yard showed no signs of spreading flames. There was no faulty wiring, no evidence of a spontaneous ignition. Every clue pointed to deliberate action.as. These findings quietly circulated through the department. The mood in Maplewood shifted. The early whispers of disbelief gave way to something colder, fear. People began locking their doors earlier at night, avoiding eye contact with strangers, and speaking in lowered voices when the pale blue house came up in conversation. The idea that a mother could harm her own child was too big to fit into the town's vision of itself, and yet the evidence was stacking up piece by piece, impossible to ignore. The investigation was no longer about whether a crime had been committed. It was about uncovering just how far Hannah had gone to hide it. The forensic team worked methodically through the blackened ruins of the shed, sifting through ash and charred fragments with small tools and gloved hands. Every movement was careful, deliberate, as if they were afraid that one wrong touch might erase the truth they were searching for. The smell of burnt wood still hung heavy in the air, mixed with something far worse, something that clung to clothing and skin long after you left the scene. They began by collecting anything that survived the flames: melted bits of metal, warped nails, and pieces of fabric that had fused into strange, unrecognizable shapes. But among these ordinary fire remnants, they uncovered the pieces that mattered. Pieces that told the real story. It started with small bones, fragile and delicate, unlike anything that could have belonged to an animal. Even before the official confirmation, everyone working the scene knew what they had found. The measurements and condition of the remains suggested the child was less than 6 months old. There were no signs of a coffin or any attempt to bury the body, only the unmistakable signs that the fire had been set directly over it. Chemical tests revealed traces of accelerants soaked into the charred wooden planks of the shed's floor. This was not the random destruction of an accident. It was intentional. Someone had made sure the flames burned hot and fast, reducing as much as possible to unrecognizable ash. But the fire had not been perfect. Something had survived. Half hidden. In a pile of partially burned debris was a small bundle of fabric. It was a baby blanket, faded from use but still soft where the flames hadn't touched it. Embroidered in one corner was a single name stitched in neat letters, the same as Hannah's last name. The embroidery thread had blackened, but it was still readable. That detail alone was enough to connect the remains to her directly. As the evidence was catalogued, the timeline began to sharpen. Witness statements placed Hannah in her backyard the night before the fire, moving something wrapped in a blanket toward the shed. No one had thought much of it at the time. She often kept to herself, and the shed was her private space. But now, those moments took on a new, chilling meaning. It became clear that whatever had happened to the baby had happened before the fire was set. The flames had been a cover, not the cause. When confronted with the forensic findings, Hannah showed no visible reaction. She didn't deny that the blanket was hers, nor did she attempt to explain why it had been found in the shed. The lack of emotion unsettled even the most experienced investigators. It was as if she had built a wall around herself, one too high. For anyone to climb, detectives reviewed her recent behavior again and again, looking for signs they had missed. Her sudden isolation after giving birth, the absence of baby supplies, the unopened support letters, they all pointed to a woman withdrawing from reality, shutting herself off from any outside influence. Combined with the physical evidence, it painted a picture that was becoming harder to turn away from Diane Maplewood. The discovery was met with disbelief and grief in equal measure. People who had once spoken kindly of Hannah now avoided her name entirely, as if speaking it might invite the darkness that seemed to surround her. Parents held their children a little closer, the image of the burned shed haunting their thoughts. Even those who had never met her felt the unease settle in their bones. By the time the forensic reports were complete, there was no longer any doubt about what had been done or who had done it. The pale blue house at the end of Willow Lane was no longer just a quiet home belonging to a private woman. It had become the center of the town's worst nightmare. And the evidence lying in neatly labeled bags at the police station told a story far more horrifying than anyone had been prepared to hear. When the arrest was made, the town braced itself for answers, but the truth that emerged in the weeks that followed was far more disturbing than anyone expected. Investigators dug through every corner of Hannah Moore's life, piecing together not just the events that led to the fire, but the thoughts that had driven her there. They spoke to the few people who had known her years before, old co-workers, distant acquaintances, even a former neighbor from another town. What they learned painted the picture of a woman who had been struggling for a long time, her world slowly shrinking until she was alone inside it. Medical records confirmed what earlier interviews had hinted at. Hannah had a history of severe depression, anxiety, and bouts of paranoia. She had been treated sporadically, but her attendance at therapy sessions became increasingly irregular, and she had stopped entirely before her pregnancy. Without support, her thoughts grew darker and less connected to reality. Friends she once had described her as distrustful, sometimes convinced that people were talking about her or plotting against her. These fears seemed to intensify after she gave birth. The most chilling detail came from notes found in her home. Written in shaky handwriting on scraps of paper and the backs of grocery receipts, they revealed a disturbing belief that someone was coming to take her baby. The notes were filled with warnings to herself, reminders to stay alert, and cryptic sentences about protecting the child from the darkness. To Hannah, these weren't the ramblings of an overworked new mother. They were instructions for survival police. Pieced together that in the days leading up to the fire, her paranoia had reached a breaking point. She stopped answering the phone, stopped opening her mail, and was seen pacing her backyard late at night. It appeared she had convinced herself that ending her child's life was the only way to save them from what she believed was coming. The decision was deliberate, the act carried out quietly, and the fire set afterward was her way of erasing the evidence. During questioning, Hannah offered little. She admitted only that she had acted to protect her baby, never explaining from what or from whom. Her voice remained flat, her eyes distant. Experts later said her emotional detachment was a sign of deep mental illness, but the court still had to decide whether that illness excused her actions. The trial was brief but intense. Prosecutors presented the forensic evidence, the accelerants, the blanket, the witness statements, while the defense argued that Hannah's mind had been overtaken by delusion, leaving her incapable of understanding the weight of her actions. The jury deliberated for less than a day. The verdict was guilty of murder and arson. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Maplewood, the case left scars that went beyond the crime itself. The pale blue house was left vacant, its windows boarded and its yard overgrown. Residents avoided walking past it, and those who had been closest to the investigation carried the images of that night with them long after the headlines faded. The shed, or what was left of it, was torn down, but its absence seemed to leave. An emptiness that nothing could fill. Some in the town found it easier to paint Hannah as a monster, someone wholly separate from themselves. Others couldn't shake the thought that she had once been an ordinary woman who simply slipped too far into her own fears. But everyone agreed on one thing. What happened on Willow Lane was something they would never forget. The memory of the fire, the smoke, and the truth that followed hung over Maplewood like a shadow. A reminder that even in the quietest places, darkness can take root when no one expects it.